Ryan, Shabbat Shalom. Hey Diana. We have Taiwan. We have New York. Hey Sissy from Arizona. Great to have you join us. Shabbat Shalom. Hey Neats, honey. Happy anniversary. Hey Alexandra from Arizona. Good to have you too with us. Hey Rob, good to have you with us. Aaron, welcome back to New York, I guess. Shabbat Shalom. Hey Jim, good to have you with us tonight. Shabbat Shalom. I love how you say Shabbat Shalom, y'all. Welcome to Sabbath Collective, a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through an Hebraic worldview of Scripture. So, for some of us, this story that we find ourselves in these days feels like nothing that we ever have experienced before. I hear people talking a lot about the critical issues that we're dealing with now, and they're saying, I've never seen anything like this. This is new. And people even say, I feel like evil is growing stronger. But this story is actually not so new. The outright excusing, the deflecting, the accepting of systemic oppression, corruption rooted in greed and the love of power that we're seeing, it's not new at all. And in fact, it's as old as time. One of my favorite preachers and writers is Barbara Brown Taylor. And she says, disillusionment is the loss of illusion about ourselves, about the world, about God. And while it is almost always painful, it is not a bad thing to lose the lies we have mistaken for truth. Such a profound thought. Again, disillusionment. It's the loss of illusion. Tonight we'll look at the new and not new time we're in. There's a pattern here, and we see it in ancient biblical history. Storytelling in scriptures is about intentional connection. It's not ever just random details. Everything has a meaningful connection. And the storyteller wants you to know, hey Madeline, great to see you, honey. Shabbat Shalom. The storyteller wants you to see something, wants you to follow the narrative thread. There's patterns and behaviors seen in these connections that are very relevant for us today because people are people. 1 Kings 9 shows us some things about Solomon and what's going on in his political empire. And he's doing, at the time, a lot of building. He's building a temple, he's building palaces, he's building storage cities, and he's building walls. And according to 1 Kings 9:15, it says the account of the forced labor, and that's the word mas, that's the Hebrew word mas, levied by King Shlomo, that's Hebrew for Solomon, for building the house of Adonai, his own palace, the Milo, that means terraces, the wall of Yerushalayim, that's Hebrew for Jerusalem, and the cities of Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gizir. And so what we see here is Solomon is doing a lot of work, but he's using, quote, forced labor to do it. And forced labor implies by the state or by the government. It's a kind of slave labor, if you will. Hey, Glenn, good to see you. Love to you and O'Dane and to those kiddos of yours. So he started, Solomon did, with a Canaanite population, and then he expanded from there. It's referred to earlier in 1 Kings 5. It says King Shlomo conscripted 30,000 men from all of Israel for forced labor. He sent them to the Lebanon, or Lebanon as we say in English, in monthly relays of 10,000. They would stay a month in the Lebanon and 2 months at home. So just so you wrap your brain around this, What happened was he got 30,000 forced labor, and then he relayed them in groups of 10,000 where they would go and work as forced labor for a month, and then they would come home. And when they came home, that's when they would work on their own businesses or on their farms. Basically, they would be forced to leave their own businesses or farms or jobs and work for Solomon at a month at a time. Then the text goes on later in the chapter to reference 80,000 hewers of stone and 70,000 transporters. So the number of people drafted or forced into the labor masses to build the temple was approximately 180,000. And here's where it gets kind of ridiculous. It's a temple. Hey, Barika, good to see you. Hey, Kate, Shabbat Shalom. By the way, Barika, I wrote to you. If you check your email and let me know if you found that. Megiddo, Ryan is saying, is a tell that was built, destroyed, and rebuilt dozens of times by different kingdoms. It's one of the biggest tells in Israel. Yeah, Ryan and I got to see that together, actually, which is interesting, this history of just building one on top of another. Kate, good to see you, honey. So this is the ironic thing here. He's using forced labor to build a temple for Adonai. Adonai, the one who saved the Hebrews from slavery. Solomon is using slave labor to build a temple to honor the slave deliverer. Are you with me here? Verse 19 goes on. It says, as well as all the cities that Shlomo had for storing supplies, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his horsemen, and other buildings Shlomo wanted to build for himself in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout the land he ruled. So Solomon here is building these store cities. Solomon here is building these store cities. Some of them are for his chariots and his horses. Some are for his possessions. Now, where did we hear this phrase store cities before? Again, just to recap, Solomon is using forced labor to build a temple, or slaves, to build a temple for the deliverer of the slaves. He's using forced labor to build cities to store his chariots and horses and his possessions. So where did we hear this phrase store cities before? Well, Exodus 1:11, speaking of the Israelite slaves of Egypt. And Exodus 1:11 says, so they put slave masters over them, this is Egyptians, over them, this is the Hebrews, to oppress them with forced labor, and they built for Pharaoh the storage cities of Pithom and Ramses. Interesting here. The enslaved Hebrews built Egyptian store cities or treasure cities for Pharaoh. Now, I want you to keep following this with me. Oh, good. Ryan, you're explaining that to Aaron. Awesome. This is what I love about us. Again, treasure cities, the Egyptian store cities or treasure cities were what the enslaved Hebrews were building for the Pharaoh. And what are they storing? What was the Pharaoh storing in these treasure cities? More than what they needed. Now, follow me here. There's a powerful spiritual energy that is connected to this kind of stockpiling. The Hebrew slaves are forced into working for those who have more than they'll ever need. Are you following me? Do you see why I say this new and not so new story that we find ourselves in? Jim says, great example of how we as a society history repeat ourselves. Absolutely. And we always do this. It is really interesting. And it's why we need to have an accurate history, by the way. So chapter 10, Solomon accumulates chariots and horses, 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. And then it says the king made silver, Solomon made silver as common as stone. So he just retrieved all this silver and stored it up in his store cities. He had so much silver that it was as common as stone. Chariots are imported from Egypt. Now, what's a chariot? What's a horse? What would you say a chariot and a horse are in this time? Weaponry, right? Weaponry. Solomon is, scriptures tell us, is importing and exporting them. Now, I want you to stay with me here because maybe you've never seen it like this before. He's an arms dealer. He's a slave maker. He's accumulating more wealth than what he'll ever need. These cities that he's building are military bases that protect the assets of the powerful. Are you with me? Give me a wow face if you never heard this before. Actually, I taught a very similar message way back in 33rd Street, but many of you may not remember it. Ryan says, building that military budget. Exactly. Hey, Nicole, great to have you join us in Costa Rica. Love you. Hope you're well. So 1 Kings 9:16, it says, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up, taken Gezer, burned it to the ground, and killed the Canaanite, or Canaanites as we say in English, living in the city. Then he had given it as a dowry for his daughter, Shlomo, which is Solomon's wife. You can't make this stuff up, right? Are you following this here? Let's recap. Solomon is marrying the daughter of the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. These are the bad guys. The Pharaoh, during this wedding time, takes over a city, the Pharaoh of Egypt. He burns it to the ground. He kills all the people in the city. And then he gives the whole city as a military base to his daughter as a wedding gift as she's marrying Solomon. Solomon's ancestors had been slaves in Egypt. Solomon now looks a lot like Pharaoh, doesn't he? I posted a movie excerpt in our members group from the movie Hook, and it was one of our family's personal favorite with Robin Williams. And the family goes to visit Granny Wendy's home. And Granny Wendy asks Peter, Robin Williams, what is so terribly important about your terribly important business? And Robin Williams says, and again, remember the storyline here, Robin Williams forgets who he is. He forgets his past. He forgets, and he goes into something and becomes something else. Robin Williams says, it's mergers and acquisitions. And then Robin Williams' son jumps in and says, if any company is struggling, Dad comes in, and if there's any resistance, he blows them out of the water. And Wendy says, so Peter, you've become a pirate. Do you remember that? It's brilliant. He's become a pirate. That's what often happens in positions of power. It happened with Solomon. I also know of a country that allegedly had people come from other countries, supposedly fleeing persecution and seeking freedom, only to colonize, murder, kidnap, make slaves, steal lands, and deny other immigrants citizenship. The story is not new. The system of oppression repeats itself over and over. Literally getting into bed with the enemy. That's exactly right, Jim. And consolidating power is what Ryan is saying. Yeah, this is a really good point. These marriages were political marriages to make alliances with other nations, and those nations really weren't supposed to make alliances with them at all. Again, Repeat, repeat, repeat. This is not just an isolated individual when we look at Solomon, who is a stockpiler or a slave master. Just like we see today with some of our political leaders, we really sort of demonize them personally and we say, my Lord, where did they come from? This person is pure evil. They're the enemy. They are our sole problem. If we get rid of them, everything will be all right. Not really. These people that we are so upset about are homegrown in our system. One person is very rarely the problem. The system is the problem. The animating energy in a system based on the need for power and more is a system of oppression. Now, Solomon has forgotten where it all has come from. And he also forgot what abundance is supposed to be for, which Yahweh says it's to take care of others. Solomon becomes the new Pharaoh, which is why his soul is in anguish at the end of his days. He's tormented. Rabbis believe he was Koheleth, which was the writer of Ecclesiastes, which was written in his old age. And if you've ever read Ecclesiastes, it's pretty darn depressing. But for some reason, because we have this sort of thing that maybe we heard, hey, Evelyn, good to see you, honey. Maybe we heard sermons when we were young. Maybe we take these texts out of their context and we say, wait, aren't we supposed to emulate Solomon? Isn't he the example of the wisest man who ever lived? His wisdom was immense. But his wisdom was a gift from Yahweh. He really had nothing to do with that other than ask for it. But here's the question. Who did he use that wisdom for? Who benefited from that wisdom? Now, before any of this happened, when God delivers the people as the slaves they were themselves from an oppressive regime, Moshe warns the people about all of this. I did not know rabbis think Solomon was the writer of Ecclesiastes. Yeah, that's interesting, right? Yeah. Not all, but many do. Many do. Many think it's Solomon. Yep. Solomon forgot God. Definitely, Barika. And, not only, he also forgot God's ways. He forgot all about God's ways. Moshe, before any of this, Moshe warns the people about all of this. Be careful, Moshe says, when you build the new world. In Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20, I'm going to read through this. It's a lot of verses, so I can't fit it on a card. Randall, what Solomon would be called a member of the power elite, exactly, according to the... Oh, that's interesting, Randall. According to sociologist C. Wright Mills, yes, the power elite is exactly what he would be defined as, absolutely. So Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20, here's Moshe's warning to the people, to the Hebrews. When you have entered the land Adonai your God is giving you, when you have taken possession of it and are living there, you may say, I want to have a king over me. And again, if you're following along with me, this is Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20. You may say, I want to have a king over me, like all the other nations around me. Now here, again, nothing new. God intended something different for them. But for some reason, people always want this sort of savior, powerful leader to take care of them. But that was actually not God's intention. It was rather a kind of theocracy with a distribution of judges throughout the land to take care of their local community, working with their local religious leaders who knew all the people in their community to interpret and apply God's laws in justice. It was not for a king. But Moshe knew that they were going to want a king. Obviously, Yahweh did too. And so Moshe goes on in this text. However, he is not to acquire many horses for himself or have the people return to Egypt to obtain more horses, inasmuch as Adonai told you never to go back that way again. So look at this. Moses is warning the people, do not go back to Egypt. And this is going to sound a little bit familiar to many of you, but I have a phrase that maybe some of you have heard me say. There is nothing that you need for your healing that comes from where you've been hurt. And so God warns them, do not go back to Egypt for anything. Don't acquire more horses from Egypt. The text goes on, inasmuch as Adonai told you never to go back that way again, likewise, he is not to acquire many wives for himself. Here's another warning, so that his heart will not turn away. And he is not to acquire excessive quantities of silver and gold. When he has come to occupy the throne of his kingdom, he is to write a copy of this Torah for himself in a scroll, from the one the Kohanim and the Leviim, that's the priests and Levites, use. So get this, he, the king, was supposed to write his own Torah onto the scrolls. And by the way, this is meticulous, painstaking writing. And when you write, what do? You learn. And the text goes on and says that scroll is to remain with him, and he is to read it in it every day as long as he lives. See, this connects to what Barika is saying. He forgot God. So that he will learn to fear Adonai his God and keep all the words of this Torah and these laws and obey them, so that he will not think he is better than his kinsmen, and so that he will not turn aside either to the right or to the left from the mitzvah. In this way, he will prolong his own reign and that of his children in Israel. Wow, that was the warning that Moses gave the people of Israel. Kate remembers that. Deuteronomy says, appoint judges and officials who do not pervert justice. There are continual warnings about what happens with justice when it gets intermingled with money and power. Justice requires level grounds. The ones that govern the system cannot be the ones with the wealth and the power. Now, if someone has wealth, good, fine, great for them. But they cannot be the ones who are making the justice. Are you following me? And this is a warning from God. This is what he tells his people. Again, not a new story what we see with Solomon. Like massive tax cuts favoring the uber rich, even though the majority of the population were against them. Like wealthy corporations that give money to lawmakers. Like even churches now receiving money from their alliances with politicians. Like people that can prosecute police for crimes that receive massive donations from police unions to fund their campaigns. Now, no matter how much we hear that this is a nation under God, none of that is biblical. And not only is it not biblical, God specifically says, do not do this. It's all fruit of the tree that Moshe warned the Israelites about. When wealth and power are being concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer, and the majority is struggling with the basic necessities, healthcare, housing, jobs, keep following me here, then more and more money is going to be spent protecting the storehouses of those who are stockpiling, right? More and more militarized groups are assembled to protect those few with all the resources from those who, quote, threaten them. And to do that, what needs to happen? More and more people need to be made slaves. The prison system fits nicely into that, doesn't it? Moshe warned the people, this will be a broken system. You can't pour money into a broken system to fix it. You can't even make new laws to fix a broken system. You've got to, as a people, as a mass, as a collective, repent from where you have gone and turn back to God's original intentions. Now, we are told at the conclusion of the building story that Solomon, and I'm quoting, spent 7 years building the temple in 1 Kings 6:38. So again, he uses forced labor to build a temple for the God who delivered from forced labor. And it took him 7 years using this forced slave labor to build this temple. Then the very next sentence, chapter 7, verse 1, it says, however, it took Solomon 13 years to complete the construction of his own palace. And then it goes on and says he built another palace for the daughter of the Pharaoh. Again, nothing new, right? Solomon, after building the temple, has a dream, and God warns him about what not to follow, or otherwise, and I'm quoting exact wording here from scriptures, this temple will become a heap of rubble. This temple that he built for God will become a heap of rubble. Now, Solomon broke nearly every detail of these laws, right down to the horses of Egypt. You know the horses of Egypt that we spoke about? That's where he got his horses. And that warning about the beautiful temple being turned to rubble, it will come true. Nebuchadnezzar will destroy the temple. In his desire to enlarge the splendor and the protection of his kingdom, Solomon introduced policies that disrupted and destroyed the lives of many in Israel. He brought untold misery and created a corrupt system of slavery and oppression. Now, the story continues on. Solomon's son and his successor to the throne, Rehoboam, now becomes the king. And again, he was homegrown as well. He was raised in this system of oppression. He grew up thinking all this was good. This was what life was. This is how we do business. When King Rehoboam was approached, because he was newly the king, about easing up on the treatment of slaves to not oppress them like his father did, he said, give me a couple days, let me think about this. And he sought some advice from the older men in the nation. And 1 Kings 12:7, the older men said to him, and this is really key, if you will start today being a servant. And that word for servant is ebed. It's different than mas, the other phrase that we read. Servant, ebed, to these people. If you will serve them, be responsive to them, and give them favorable consideration, then they will be your servants. Same word, ebed, forever. So in other words, the older people were talking really about servant leadership. When people know that their leader cares for them and gives them favorable consideration, they'll be loyal to the leader as the leader is loyal to them. Good advice. But he didn't take the advice that the older men gave it, and it dropped to the floor. Instead, he consulted the younger men he had grown up with. Again, this is important. These are young men who grew up in this systemic oppression. They saw it. They were the people, the power kids, right? So he asked them what they think. They're now his attendants. And he says, what advice would you give me so that we can give an answer to these people who said to me, lighten the yoke that your father laid on us. I'm quoting the text. The young men he had grown up with said to him, these people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter for us. Here's the answer you should give them. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Meaning, you think Solomon was bad? Solomon was a wimp compared to me. Then the text goes on, yes, my father burdened you with a heavy yoke, but I will make it heavier. My father controlled you with whips, but I will control you with scorpions. You see these homegrown political leaders that grew up in systemic oppression as the power people. This is what happens. So Rehoboam sends his head slave driver, Adoniram, off to discipline the people, to get them in line. By the way, that sounds familiar, right? Because the Egyptians did the same thing to the Jews when they asked for a couple of days to go worship their God. They made their loads heavier. It's crazy, isn't it? They're doing the same thing that they were delivered from. So Adoniram was over Solomon's forced labor back when he was building the temple. And he's still in that same position for Rehoboam. Now, the people are done. They're over their load limit. And they stone Adoniram. They kill him. And Israel, except for one tribe, abandons Rehoboam. They pull out of the nation, and the kingdom splits. So, did the kingdom divide because of oppressive slavery? Perhaps that was one reason, but it's probably accurate to say that the blatantly oppressive leadership of Rehoboam was the last straw. Now, in recapping this and summing this up, I want for us to make sure that we kind of see this and make these connections. His slave driver name was derived from Adonai. Good question, Aaron. I don't know. It does have Adon, which is the same root, but that would be interesting. I'm not sure about that. That's interesting. Barika says, I'll post it. I'll do some research and post it. When you support and maintain systems of oppression, you cut off God's communion. Absolutely, with people. Absolutely. So it was probably accurate to say that the blatantly oppressive leadership of Rehoboam was it for them. Now, let's track here. The purpose of a system is what it does. I don't care. You can have all the great taglines you want, but the purpose of a system is what it does. We know that because we think Hebraically, right? And Hebraically is about doing. It doesn't matter what you say. What happens, what you do, that's what you're about. The purpose of a system is what it does. A system resists change, and it projects present patterns into the future. Let me say that one more time to you. A system resists change. This is any kind of system that there is. Anything, whether it's your body or a political system, anything, a church, anything. A system resists change, and it projects present patterns into the future. A system does that to protect itself. And an oppressive system's animating energy is power, it's greed, it's fear. Maybe you can come up with some other words. We see where we are now, and that this is not a new story. The Hebrew worldview of this is it's not about that this happened. It's about that this happens, like Jim was saying. It's about that this happens. The purpose of a system is what it does or produces. Yeah, I think that you could do either way, Ryan. Yep. Yep. So here's what we really need to focus on here. Uh, Solomon wanted, well, let me just walk that back a little. The purpose of a system should be what it produces, and what it should produce would be good. But a system that is used for power, it more becomes about what it does rather than what it produces. Now, production is going to be in everything about the system, but a system kind of grinds. So what does a system do? Well, a system blocks, a system inhibits, a system lies, a system bombards the brain so that we have a hard time. Like, all of these things are what systems do, because they're projecting the present onto the future, and they're trying to make sure that they survive. That's what systems do. Okay? So Solomon, maybe he wanted to do something good in the beginning. He certainly had a great mother that read to him and taught him many good things. Maybe he started out good, but slowly he ended up trying to do what he thought was a good thing in an evil way. And then that pattern continues with his son, getting worse and worse. Now, this is really the crux of what I want to talk to you about tonight. You see, mixed good and evil is a problem. Mixed good and evil is a problem, because then people cannot discern. Evil usually likes to hide in the shadows and become entangled with the good. And we see that now a lot. And one little example of this is, as most of you know, I am very about the health and the brain, the body's health, and about the brain, and I read a lot. And a couple of the scientists that I read, right when SARS-CoV-2 was in the beginning of the time, were wanting to talk about herd immunity as opposed to quarantine, because of the dangers. They wanted to talk through the dangers of quarantine on the health and economic and reasons and blah, blah, blah. And they were scientists. And they had one opinion, and people that wanted to quarantine had another opinion, also based on science, right? But what happened is these couple scientists that I always had read got kind of caught up with these other people. And they ended up being on their state's Capitol building protest along with gun-toting, red hat-wearing anti-maskers. See, that's the problem. And evil loves that. It loves when it all gets jumbled together. And then people who maybe read those scientists or those doctors before and said, well, wait, but they're saying this and I trust them, and they're with these people, so therefore these people must be right. All kinds of alliances now we see for the purpose of a common agenda. But the compromises. Evil hides and mixes and entangles. This way it cannot get exposed for what it is. So it hides behind promises and slogans and points to doing the good things it's going to do. Then it can infect and pervert a thing. Evil is always looking to attach itself to good. But here's the good part. The thing about evil, it's extremely prideful. It will reveal itself and it will flex its muscles. With Rehoboam, evil spoke and acted as evil. It showed its face, blatant, brazen, unapologetic, like throwing up white supremacist signs on Twitter, seen by all. What evil seems to forget is that it cannot live in the light. When it thinks it can, it actually ends up committing suicide. See, when we see what's going on now, we may think it's getting worse because maybe we see it more and more. But I want to throw out and suggest maybe it's not that it's getting worse or even greater or increasing. Maybe it's getting revealed. It's getting uncovered. It's getting refined. And that's a funny word for me to use, but the definition means removing any other elements but the purest essence of the thing. So that's kind of a cool definition of what's happening with evil. It's getting refined. Everything is being removed but the pure essence of it. It's not hiding in the shadows. What we see with people capturing violence and acts of white women policing their neighbors, what we see captured on cell phones now is a real-time example. We see clearly what's going on. It's coming out from the shadows. It's in the light. And at the same time, goodness is getting refined too. It's becoming bolder. And just like the people had enough, and there was a revolution and a departure from the system with Rehoboam, the bolder hate is, the stronger love counters. Hate cannot live in the light. It dies. Hate cannot live in the light. It dies. It will either be removed or forced back into the dark closet. But love confronts. It exposes. It brings it into the light. And hate will become what it is without any filters. And then people will choose their paths. Now, we have a lot of great leaders that are kind of leading us as a people into paths. Andre and Randall and all kinds of amazing people giving us suggestions of how to be revolutionary change here. But this is what's happening in the spiritual realm right now. John 3:20 records Yeshua's words. Yeshua says, "For everyone who does evil things hates the light and avoids it, so that his actions won't be exposed." And here's the thing. It cannot hide in the shadows any longer. The light is being shown. We're going to close this time with the lighting of the Shabbos candles. And traditionally, the mothers of the home light the candles. And the candles represent and connect us to peace and to joy and to unity. And then she encircles the candles with her hands 3 times, which is a tradition that welcomes in the Sabbath. Lord, we ask for light and more light. Send the light to shine in every dark corner. Use our voices, use our eyes, use our presence, use our phones, use whatever method you want to use to help expose and bring light into the darkness. Let the evil be refined, and let the goodness be refined as well. Send that light that provokes us to do good in ways that build new systems. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.